again, I understood it in its context, and so we didn't have big arguments about it. In fact, I think most people just said, oh, that's his worship style. He likes that liturgical stuff. But basically, I was Anglican for 15 years plus, and it was a very rich time. But then in the early 21st century, we had moved back. Focus asked me to come back again, and so we moved back to Colorado Springs. And the Episcopal Church began to implode around issues of sexuality and all of these things. And the key part of that for me, and the critical turning point, there were two of them. One was I realized you had people with equal authority, very intelligent, and bishops in the church, in two different positions on Scripture. And I began to think, all right, no, wait a minute, the issue isn't Scripture, but it's who has the authority to interpret Scripture and establish doctrine? Because all of this fractured, everybody having their own opinion is fine, but that's not what a church is meant to be. And so who has the authority to do that? And I thought, I'm going to find out. And I'm now going to go back beyond the 500-year point. And I began to move back into the early church. I wanted to know, what did the Bible say about that? What did the generation after the first Christians believe by way of authority, interpretation of Scripture, and all of that? And so I began a gentle journey. I wasn't out to become anything else. I wasn't out to leave my Anglican experience. I was actually thinking I'm in the fight till the end, whatever the end is going to be. But that question stayed with me, and there was that experience. And then I was at a C.S. Lewis conference in Austin, Texas, and Peter Kraft was speaking on the 10 things to learn about evil from Tolkien. And he was wonderful. And I met him at the break, and I went up and learned that he had become a Catholic while he was attending Calvin College years before. Right. And here's where I show my bigotry. And all I can call it is bigotry. Because at that moment I knew he was teaching philosophy in Boston, and this is a man who knows his stuff. And my thought was, how could a man this smart be a Catholic? And rather than stop there, which I might have done years before, and say, well, it's everyone his own taste. Maybe he just, I don't know, it doesn't matter. I actually stopped and thought, what is he seeing that I'm not seeing? And if I'm going to go back and explore the ancient church to answer the one question, I suddenly realized I was going to have to put aside some prejudices. And for me, that was, I now need to put aside pretty much everything every well-meaning Protestant ever told me about the ancient church and Catholicism. And I also need to put aside all the misrepresentations I saw from Catholics. I said, I'm going to just put these two groups aside, and I'm going to go in a sort of a pure way as best as I can to investigate and figure out what in the world the early church believed and why they believed it. And so over the next 5 or 6 years, that's what I was doing. It was a very gentle thing. I had no intention of being Catholic. I had no intention of being Orthodox. I was investigating both at the same time.
As far as you knew, what you would discover would strengthen where you already are.
Right. And it might reinforce some of my ideas about what the church ought to be, or what maybe the way forward for my Anglicanism might be. But making a huge change was not part of the equation for me. And during that time, I talked to a wonderful Orthodox priest, and then I came into relationship with some Catholic priests who really captured for me the essence of what it was to be Catholic. And I mean by experientially. I could do all the reading, but to see it actually played out in someone's life meant a lot to me. And so that began to move, and I became I had been friends for years with Dan Burke, whom you know. Yeah. And Dan and I were on parallel journeys, and he was a huge help and influence during this time. And finally got to a point, I think John Henry Newman says that there's usually a million reasons why someone will become Catholic, but usually one catalyst. And basically the church we were attending, the Episcopal Church, split. Now, I'd never experienced a church split before, But it was pretty much between the traditional Orthodox group and the group that wanted to split off now, and the group that wanted to stay part of the Episcopal community. And I looked and said, I can't go with either. It's now changed. I had moved from if I become Catholic to when I become Catholic. And when that split happened, that I was done. There was really no reason to stay and fight for something I was no longer sure about. And I thought it's time to make this transition.
Our guest is Paul McCusker.